Biden kept saying, as long as it takes, as long as it takes. All that meant was until you run out of Ukrainians. It's absolutely tragic what happened. Biden's a completely incompetent president, I'm sorry to say. But I don't say it out of malice. I say it out of experience because it was predictable what was going to happen, and they just couldn't understand the diplomatic road.
Good evening. My name is Lasha Kasradze on Imedi Television Network. Today, we have a very special session with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. You are a great advocate for restrained and realist foreign policy. Have you followed the latest events in Georgia and the region, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, I have been following the events with a lot of concern. The events are complicated all through the southern Caucasus, not only in Georgia, but in Armenia and in Azerbaijan. I happened to be in the neighborhood in Azerbaijan for the Baku climate conference just a few weeks ago, and also in Yerevan. So I've been recently, and of course I had a fabulous visit to Tbilisi a few years ago and saw the beauty of Georgia. You know, there are three countries, all of them somewhat stressed in the southern Caucasus, and there are three big powers around them, and that, of course, is Russia, Turkey, and Iran. So this is a complicated neighborhood. But my very strong view is that the three countries of the Caucasus really need to cooperate. Look, Georgia is a survivor over thousands of years. Same with the Armenians. And in this tight space, even though there's a lot of conflict and open war, indeed, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, the three are all in a fragile situation and they need to cooperate for their mutual security. And then my view is that with the three much larger powers around, Russia, the most powerful, but also Iran is no slouch and Turkey is no slouch. I think that there is a shared interest of the major powers in the region for calm, for peace, for economic development, for the famous north-south and east-west corridors. And I like the idea, I hope it's not naive, but I call it 3+3, the three Southern Caucasus countries and the three major powers around them really having a normal, ongoing dialogue and joint investment program, sustainable development strategy, and a practical way forward. I think that the outside powers, the United States and Europe, should have a lot of prudence, not to destabilize matters. And so I worry often about what the United States does, because I am an American who has watched the United States for decades, and we have a tendency to stir up things without really much local knowledge, without much sensitivity, and indeed without much care for the smaller countries. I told my Ukrainian counterparts many, many years ago, be careful. Don't fall into a U.S. trap that, oh, you're going to side with the U.S. and all's going to be well. Don't become a battleground. Don't play U.S. geopolitics, because you'll end up in the middle. And you don't want to be in the middle. In fact, I warned them very clearly. My line was, don't become the Afghanistan of Europe. And they did, unfortunately. They said, oh, we're going to join NATO. This was very naive. very naive of the Ukrainians. How can you join NATO and expect to be in peace? Russia is absolutely against the United States having its military up against its border with Ukraine, perfectly understandably, in my view. In other words, we have to think from all directions, and we have to take a holistic vision of things so that we don't provoke and stir up war. And so this is all to say that the South Caucasus is an amazing part of the world. First of it, it's got some of the richest history of the entire planet. Every empire imaginable has crossed the region, so this is something amazing. And yet, the people of Georgia, the people of Armenia, the Turkish ethnicities of Azerbaijan, the Azeris, these are lasting. They've lasted a long, long time. And we don't want empires crossing this region except maybe shipping some goods or fiber optics or other tourism, all of which would be quite good. But we should be done with the wars in the region, and we should all exercise a kind of desire and policy of diplomacy, prudence, restraint, so as not to create just another upheaval.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more personally, and I'm sure the whoever is listening to us will most likely share your wise advice. Georgia is a tiny country, as you know, 3.7, 3.8 million people. And we have had unprecedented attention from the West, from the European Union, from the United States, of course. Seems to me that we can be a beacon of liberty whenever it fits the Washington consensus, the neoconservative, neoliberal establishment, deep state, the blob, whatever you want to call it. There are so many phrases for these things nowadays. And that very same beacon of liberty, when it's actually more democratic, can be criticized as pro-Russian, as less democratic, when in reality, Georgia today, and it was never a perfect democracy, it's not a consolidated democracy, let's be honest here, but it has come a long way from the beacon of liberty as it was known under the George W. Bush administration and the Freedom Agenda programs, as you, I'm sure, very clearly recall. And yet today we are seeing a pressure, an outright direct pressure from Brussels, from Washington, with accusations that this government is not democratic, that is turning its back against the West and moving towards Russia. What should give here? What do you think is at play? And do you think this is the part of sort of the traditional collective West, and particularly the United States foreign policy tradition, to flip-flop this way and to not only confuse everyone, but to maybe even cost Georgia its own statehood, as we almost saw happen in 2008 as a result of such narratives moving goalposts as they see fit kind of principle in crafting their foreign policy towards the region?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that Washington has no knowledge of Georgia and no care about Georgia. Georgia is a piece on a chessboard, and this is a game between the United States and Russia. In fact, one of our leading strategists, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a famous geopolitician, in the 1990s wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, where he basically portrayed the world as a game of the great powers. My strong advice is, if you want to play a game, do it on a real chessboard, not in real life. When I was young, we used to play the game of Risk, so-called. The goal was to get your piece on every part of the world. But unfortunately, American strategists play games with other countries, and they behave as if it's a game, but they leave behind a lot of turmoil and even tragedy. Let me give you an example. The whole question of Georgia joining NATO has nothing to do with Georgia. It has everything to do with the U.S. view of Russia. The idea is not about Georgian protection. The idea that goes back 30 years is to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. And this idea, by the way, goes back 170 years, because this was an idea of the British Empire, who are the most cynical of all people in the world, in my experience. So if the Americans are bad, the British are even worse, because they were the world empire for even longer. And in the 1850s, their idea, led by Lloyd Palmerston, and he got his next door neighbor, Napoleon III, to join him, was to push Russia out of the Black Sea. Now remember, Russia's fleet, ever since Catherine the Great, was in Sevastopol. It was founded in 1783. But Lord Palmerston thought that Britain, as being the master of the Navy, could defeat the fleet and throw Russia out of the Black Sea, and thereby make Russia a third-rate country. Now, why did Britain want to do that? Well, it wanted to rule the world, and in particular, it had a fear that Russia would compete with Britain even in Central Asia and in India. It was a kind of mad idea. But when you're trying to rule the world, each piece of the puzzle or each place on the chessboard looks strategic to you. And so Lord Palmerston, who could care less about the Caucasus, actually wanted to go on and fight the Crimean War in the Caucasus, no less. So this goes back 170 years to the 1850s. And the United States is the student of Britain. And the U.S., with Zbigniew Brzezinski's policy, was to follow the Palmerston model and surround Russia and make Russia a third-rate country. And he actually describes this in his book, The Global Chessboard. He even says in a whole long chapter, Russia can't resist. It's too weak to resist this. So it was a kind of gamble also. We can push NATO and there's nothing Russia can do. Now I have to tell you a story. In 2008, in Bucharest, at the NATO summit, George Bush Jr. demanded that NATO commit to incorporating Ukraine and Georgia. And the European leaders at the time, especially Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, knew this was very dangerous. This was a complete provocation against Russia's red line. So they tried to stop it in Bucharest. But you know, NATO is not an alliance. NATO is the United States with a very weak Europe alongside. And so George Bush put his hand down and insisted, and they agreed that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. And the Europeans say this until this day. And the US says this. Russia said it's completely a red line. There's no way we're going to let this happen. Now, in the spring of 2008, after Bucharest, Mikhail Saakashvili came to New York City. And he came to a place called the Council on Foreign Relations, which is our kind of establishment center. I happen to be a member of that with thousands of other people, but I happen to be a member. So I got an invitation to come hear Saakashvili talk. And I thought, I'm curious. I'll go find out. And it's right across the park from where I live, from Central Park. So I walked to the east side and went in. And then Saakashvili gave a speech. And he said, Georgia is in the middle of Europe. Georgia is a European country. Georgia will join NATO. Georgia is a core member of the European Union. I have to tell you, knowing a little geography and knowing a little politics, I walked out and I called my wife on the cell phone and I said, this guy's crazy. This guy's going to get his country ruined. You know, I have to also say that every time he said this, Georgia's in the middle of Europe, everybody's applauding at the Council on Foreign Relations. Oh, they're so happy. And he says, we're going to join NATO. Oh, they're so happy. And I knew this is reckless talk. This is complete provocation. And a few weeks afterwards came the war. And it was a disaster, but completely predictable and egged on by the United States. Because Saakashvili, some adult should have sat down with him and said, don't talk this way. This is dangerous for you. This is reckless for you. Be careful. Be prudent. Don't provoke your powerful neighbor to the north. The United States is not your neighbor. The United States is thousands of miles away. You have a neighbor right next door. Be careful. But nobody told him that. All they did was give him big applause. Oh, how wonderful. But the United States can't save Georgia from itself or from its next door neighbor. You need prudence. You need care. You need normal diplomacy, not this bravado that we are NATO and we can do what we want. And this, unfortunately, was obvious to me back in 2008, and the results were terrible, and they showed up just a few weeks after he came to the Council on Foreign Relations. So there's a lot that's quite understandable about this. And countries like Georgia, countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, you have to look at a map and look at the neighborhood. And unless you move, you better be realists and smart. It doesn't mean to give up one's nationhood, not at all. It just means to be prudent and intelligent. And there's an old line of Henry Kissinger, who was a realist, and he said famously to be a friend of he said to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And what he meant was the U.S. tells you, we love you. The U.S. doesn't care at all. They don't even know where Atlanta, Georgia is, our own Georgia, much less where Tbilisi, Georgia is. Honestly, I'm telling you the truth. And so you just have to be very, very careful. I'm not saying give up, defeat, surrender. No, just be prudent with your next door neighbor. Be pleasant. Same with Turkey. Same with Iran. Lots of hate and thinking that Brussels is going to save you. Come on, this is ridiculous. Or that Washington, another 3,000 miles away. Come on, we have to get realistic. And that's what I tried to tell the Ukrainians. They would not listen to me, because they heard sweet talk from Washington. We've got your back for as long as it takes. Well, they're just getting killed on the battlefield. What does it mean as long as it takes? Until you literally run out of every Ukrainian? And they've lost hundreds of thousands of people because they listened to what I could tell them was completely reckless behavior. The one thing the Ukrainians should have said from the beginning is, don't push NATO here, please. We don't want to upset anything. We've got quiet. No one's invading us. Don't provoke anything. And it would have been quiet.
Well, the civilized world could not agree with you more. That includes Georgia. we have just a few minutes extra that we've been given. Just a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. How do you think? Where do you envision Ukraine war? How do you think it's going to end? And what are the effects that its results are going? Whatever results there might be, if it's going to turn into a frozen conflict or whatever. But what do you think the implications on the South Caucasus, particularly in Georgia, are going to be?
I think that it could end, it needs to end just absolutely any moment it could end. The way that it could properly end would be the President of the United States declares that Ukraine will not join NATO and that Russia should stop fighting on that basis. And that's the basic deal, that the United States acknowledges it was a bad idea to try to expand NATO because that crossed a Russian red line that is an understandable red line, by the way, because Russia does not want the U.S. military on its border. And for a lot of justifiable reasons, I might say. I don't want Russia on our border, frankly. I think big powers should stay away from each other. This is the first point. So that's how the war is going to end. I think in the end, if it goes in a negotiated way, not a frozen conflict, but a negotiated way, what should happen is that there would be an end of NATO enlargement, an end of Russian fighting, international security guarantees for Ukraine in the UN Security Council. There would be land concessions because for sure Russia's not leaving Crimea. This is without question. But I don't think it's leaving what it's gotten in the Donbass or Zaporizhia and Kherson, the four oblasts that are at stake, and how the final territorial settlement is made. I don't know. It's part of the whole package of negotiations. But the package would include neutrality, an end of NATO enlargement, security guarantees for Ukraine, a territorial adjustment of some kind, and finally an end of sanctions against Russia and a normalization of relations, economic and political, with Russia. That's what I would like to see. It's within reach. This is how this war should end. This war never should have started. If they had listened to me in the White House, it wouldn't have started, because I said how to avoid the war, how to stop the war immediately after it started. And it's important to remember that even in March 2022, Russia and Ukraine agreed on principles without Ukraine giving up any of the Donbass, by the way. All Russia was asking for in March 2022 was that the Minsk agreements be confirmed, which gave autonomy to the Donbass, not territory to Russia, autonomy to the Donbass. And I said, take the deal. And the United States blocked the deal. Now it's much worse for Ukraine. By the way, I wrote a piece in the spring of 2022, say, take the deal. It's only going to get worse for you. And every word I wrote then, 2.5 years ago, I would stand by now. Not that I had a crystal ball. It was just obvious what was going to happen. Was Ukraine really going to defeat Russia? Are you kidding? No way. So it was obvious. Take the deal. But they didn't, because the United States, Biden kept saying, as long as it takes, as long as it takes. All that meant was until you run out of Ukrainians. It's absolutely tragic what happened. Biden's a completely incompetent president, I'm sorry to say. But I don't say it out of malice. I say it out of experience, because it was predictable what was going to happen, and they just couldn't understand the diplomatic road.
It is, yes, it is unfortunate. We can call it the deep state. We can call it the neocon, neoliberal obsession, fanaticism, however you want to frame it. but it goes way back. I mean, this is part of, and every state, I think John Mearsheimer has said that many times before, every state has its own deep state, and it's understandable in a way, but not to the extent where you overextend yourself and jeopardize the rest of the planet, basically.
There you go.
Yes, you probably referred to the March agreement, the Istanbul communique, right? Communique, yes, that's what it was.
Exactly.
Correct.
I flew to Turkey to talk with the mediators about that. I learned the details of it. This is an agreement that could have been reached and ended the war just days after the special military operation started. But they were told by the United States and then by Britain, don't take it, which is, of course, terrible, bad advice. Terrible. And it did a lot of damage.
That was such a critical moment. That was going to be if basic common sense were used. And I also remember, just as a comment, additional comment to what you've said, former Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, saying that it is now that we have to negotiate in the beginning of the war, if you recall that, sir, when he basically said that, look, this is the best time that we can close the deal, during which we can close the deal with Russia, because things are not going to look as good moving forward. And
exactly.
To him, no one. Professor, just one of the final question here on the sort of geopolitical arrangement of the South Caucasus as a holistic geopolitical space. As I mentioned earlier, there are few conceptual explanations, theories, concepts that are flowing around in Georgia. Unfortunately, it is just now that it's starting to happen, realizing what the truth actually turned out to be. Do you see it mostly as 3+3, Georgia's role in that formula, or do you think Georgia should also obviously, and the wider South Caucasus, meaning all the three republics, invite the West, its strategic partners, United States, Europe, and sort of turn the region into sort of a holistic geopolitical space in which just geoeconomic projects and economic intercourse, starting from China all the way coming to the West, will triumph, and basically everyone will make money instead of being subjected to this parasitic, really, foreign policy of egging Georgia against Russia?
The best world is an open, multipolar, multilateral world that is at peace, that operates under the UN Charter, and that has open trade and interconnectedness. I've often said that China with its Belt and Road Initiative and the European Union with its so-called global gateway should actually partner, and China can invest from east towards the west. Europe can invest from the west towards the east. They can meet in the middle. Tbilisi will be a place on that path. Samarkand will be a place on that path. We used to have the Silk Roads. Of course, the whole idea of the Belt and Road Initiative of China is in part modeled on the 2,000 years of East-West trade. In 1498, when Vasco da Gama circled the southern tip of Africa by ship, that was, in a way, the end of the Silk Road for a time, because it was cheaper to go from Europe to Asia and back by ship rather than over land. But in the 21st century, the land connectivity becomes very important again. It becomes important for fast rail, it becomes important for freight, it becomes important for fiber optic connectivity, it becomes important for tourism, it becomes important for cultural exchange. And obviously the South Caucasus is also a strategic region, again, a north-south and east-west corridor. So it is, and that's why their history is also so rich culturally, actually ecologically. The great wines that Georgia invented, maybe the first vineyards in history. So this is really a treasured area, and it will thrive in a peaceful, open world. And so the 3+3 is the immediate neighborhood, and that's the most important. It's really most important. Get along with your neighbors. And that means the three Southern Caucasus countries, but then it means the neighboring powers of the three South Caucasus countries. But then all of those countries actually depend on longer trade. Iran and Russia are part of the BRICS. The BRICS include China and India. Well, they both should be partners, definitely for Georgia as well. China does so many things so well, by the way, in infrastructure and 5G and so forth. India is surging economically, so they will also be partners. I'd like Europe and the United States to be cooperative and friendly and investing and coming as tourists, because there is a lot of cultural heritage and history and beauty. But I don't want the U.S. and Europe viewing this geopolitically, because they'll just make a mess. And that's the mess that we've been talking about. So 3+3 plus the broader world, definitely. Maybe at some point, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan will actually become members of the BRICS. It's perfectly possible, depending on how that evolves. I'm hoping, very much hoping, that Iran's diplomacy, which itself is a time for a whole nother show, of course,
Yes.
but, Iran has joined the BRICS. It's made close relations with China. It has normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. This is also very promising and very exciting. And by the way, I'm a fan of Persia, I have to say, because Persia goes back to 3,200 BC. It's one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. It's given us absolutely wonderful treasures for 5,000 years. And so this is a good neighbor that also should be part of the story. So this is the age we should have: cultural diversity, peace, trade, connectivity, and lots of good tourism, I would say.
I think that's a very good way to end our conversation. I personally would love to pick your brain, like Judge Napolitano always tells his guests. But unfortunately, we're limited with time. This was a wonderful experience, not just for me, but for my colleagues in Georgia, here in the States, and for the Georgian audience. I am sure of that. I would like to, on behalf of Imedi Television, I'd like to extend our invitation to you to come to Tbilisi.
Wonderful.
And at any time, you are more than welcome to come on to Imedi TV, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your inexhaustible, intellect and storied ideas, and just to show the Georgian society that there is another world out there, contrary to what they have been presented in the past 30 years, that the West itself is experiencing problems, and it's not just one-sided or one-way street. This is a two-way street that has to be taken into account. Professor, once again, thank you so much. We will continue this, I'm sure.
Wonderful. Great.
And thanks a lot for being with us. We've been honored.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.